Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the MintCast. This is the official podcast of MintPress News, and I am your host, Mnar Adley. And today we're going to be joined by a very important guest, Cradle columnist and editor Sharmine Narwani, based in Beirut. Thank you, Sharmine, for joining us today.
Thanks.
Now, no matter how bad the attack on Palestine gets, Israel seems to find a way to make it worse. Now, recently, Israel has managed to raise the stakes once again, killing Hamas political leader Ismael Haniyeh while he was in Tehran, and assassinating Hezbollah commander Fuad Shukr in Beirut. Hezbollah has vowed to respond and declared that the war has entered a new phase. So what exactly does all of this mean, and are we heading to a wider regional conflict? So let's first talk about this recent spate of high-profile political killings of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. Israel has been killing ordinary civilians in mass for months now in this genocide, but assassinating top leaders in other countries seems to mark a heightening of their violence. So, Sharmine, talk to me about this. What is Israel trying to achieve here?
Before I got on with you, Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah was giving a speech to commemorate the 1 week passing of Fuad Shukr. And he, as he is wont to do, he goes into great detail, spinning the story and the background of why we are where we are now and why we need to go to the next step, which then he outlines for us. I mean, he's a really good teacher in that sense. Nobody's left wondering, because he tries to be very transparent and make things clear to viewers who are usually quite worried about the situation on the ground. And he talked, he hasn't finished his speech as far as I know, but he talked about the fact that Israel is crossing all kinds of red lines now. I mean, in a way, he suggests that Israel is increasingly displaying unhinged behavior, but he says that comes from weakness and vulnerability, that Israel very clearly cannot fight its wars by itself, with just facing just one adversary on one front, as in Iran on April 13th and 14th. Israel required the active assistance of 3 Western nuclear powers and a regional Arab state, Jordan, to basically thwart the Iranian attack. Now, it's very true. I think Nasrallah even mentioned in an earlier speech a few months back that, and I think he's repeated this theme actually, that within a month of October 7th, Israel had more or less depleted many of its weapons, of its arsenal, and were absolutely reliant at that point. So for most of this war, Tel Aviv has been reliant on U.S. weapons, a active duty U.S. supply line of air shipments and otherwise to Israel. And even now, it's clear Netanyahu went over to Washington recently to ask for more weapons and faster. But the U.S. military, I remember an article from about 2 months back saying that they were turning down orders from different places because they had a backlog. Okay, so U.S. weapons production is on the slow side. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Hamas and other Palestinian resistance forces are churning out weapons in their underground projectile facilities. So I think we're looking at a more unhinged Israel because it's running out of options, because it is super vulnerable, because it's lost its strategic depth in the region so dramatically, because it, I think, has never been so isolated in the sense that even Western allies, and a lot of times you'll see this in news articles, but they won't name the country, that countries have quietly stopped weapons flows to Israel, but don't want to be named because they're worried about, their respective Israeli lobbies going at them. So, this is a country that's economy is hemorrhaging fast. Since the assassinations last week, the Israeli shekel has dropped so dramatically. Its stock market has dropped so dramatically. It's impacted other stock markets around the world. And, trade, Israel relies on 80% of its imports coming via waterways. And of course, Yemen has essentially removed taken major Israeli trade routes out of commission. So, then of course, there's domestic crisis between the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, who don't want to serve in the army, and then the rest of the Israelis who want them to do service. There's prior to October 7th, there's there were massive domestic protests about judicial reform and corruption in the state. So, from inside and from outside, Israel's situation looks very ugly for the state. This is why it's resorting to assassinations. For Israeli intelligence services, this has long been viewed as the low-hanging fruit. If you cannot defeat the enemy, strike at their leaders. As though America would collapse if you took out Joe Biden, as though the UK would collapse if you took out Keir Starmer, which, by the way, who knows, they may collapse. But in fact, non-state actors in this region within the resistance axis, like Hezbollah and Hamas, have often had their number ones and number twos assassinated, but the organizations keep ticking on and even grow stronger. October 7th happened despite assassinations of top Hamas leaders for decades. Hezbollah now has the capabilities to take out all of Israel's eyes and ears on its borders, its radar systems, surveillance equipment, reconnaissance, drones even, and it did not have that capability before. So taking out Hezbollah's top military commander, remember Ismael Haniyeh, right? The Americans and Israelis assassinated him in Damascus years ago, and Hezbollah has still gone from strength to strength. They took out Qasem Soleimani in Iran, and the IRGC launched its most potent attacks against American bases in its history. So, it's a bad strategy for Israel, their assassinations policy, but as Nasrallah says, it does show a weak and vulnerable Israel more than anything else.
Well, and I think a big question on many people's mind is how exactly did this assassination of Haniyeh even happen? We have conflicting reports about Haniyeh being hit by a short-range projectile, with his location being tracked by spyware through his WhatsApp, and reports coming out from the New York Times and Axios saying that there were bombs planted in his hotel room months in advance. What do we know about what exactly happened that day?
Well, the New York Times also reported that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So that's the New York Times for you in a situation of war. They absolutely toe their government line and leak information that is beneficial to their side. This New York Times article was ludicrous. It's similar to when the Iranian nuclear scientist was assassinated. I can't remember which Western outlet, did this like play-by-play story that sounded like a Hollywood movie script. The motorcycles weaved in and out of traffic, and they could spot the nuclear scientist's car from 6 meters away, and they approached it thus. It's drama, it's entertainment news. The thought that right after this attack, 3 or 4 New York Times journalists, did any investigation whatsoever in Tehran is ridiculous. They were handed that information. Nobody at the Times did any investigative work. That's what journalism does. They were handed that information and they just spit it back out. So, of course, the Iranians, didn't respond right away because, as one should do, one should investigate a crime, right? And look at it from all angles. They're still investigating Raisi's helicopter crash, for instance, and there have been, as far as I recall, at least 2 rounds of investigative results that have come out on that. These are not things that you know overnight sitting in New York, you know. So, but further to the Iranian telling of the story, that it was a short range, it appears to be a short range projectile that was guided projectile that hit Haniyeh's room specifically. We at the Cradle also got a chance to speak to Khalid Kadumi, who is the Hamas representative in Iran, who said it is as the Iranians say, that, you know, you cannot listen to the propaganda that's coming out from elsewhere. They simply do not know that Hamas's reading of the situation was similar to Iran's. Khalid Kadumi was on the scene. He was staying in the same location, and when you know, loud noises were heard, immediately ran and saw Haniyeh lifeless. And so he, you know, he spoke about the damage to the ceiling and the walls that are that appeared to be representative of a missile strike, as opposed to an explosive from inside the property. So, you know, forget the New York Times. What do they know? They weren't there. They didn't investigate. But I think this was a gut blow to Hamas. Haniyeh wasn't just the chief, you know, negotiator and point man in ceasefire talks, but he was also one of these unique personalities in the Palestinian resistance movement that had been kind of rocked by I guess, differing perspectives and objectives within Hamas over the course of the Syrian conflict and afterwards. But he was interesting in that he had good connections with all elements of Hamas and other Palestinian factions, importantly. So this was a guy who was trusted enough by the Qassam Brigade's folks inside Gaza to speak on their behalf. He was also, I mean, he was the Politburo chief. He was voted by Hamas cadres to become the Politburo chief of Hamas. He also had relations with the Palestinian Authority, and he was a point man for Hamas in many of the regional and international capitals. So, you know, the Israelis always like to take out moderate or effective leaders of the resistance axis. And Ismael Haniyeh was one in a line of many they have targeted. And of course, not just resistance leaders, people who, you know, artists and fiction writers, you know, who are celebrated in the Palestinian heart, who galvanize the spirit. Those have all been assassinated too by Israel. So, but what has changed? No, the Palestinian issue is on the table firmly, thanks to the events of October 7th, and it's not going to budge until Israel is defeated.
Okay, I want to talk about the assassination in Tehran being a Iranian intelligence failure, as some people have called it. They've asked, you know, how could this have happened under Iran's watch? However, we also know that Israel has successfully targeted and assassinated many Iranian political leaders and even nuclear scientists. How do you respond to that?
You know, not in defense of Iran by any means. I mean, this was a very high-profile event. It was the inauguration ceremony of incoming Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. And so there were a lot of heads of state there, as well as foreign ministers and other dignitaries. So this is a very bad look for the Iranians, much like, you know, terror events at the Olympics in the US, you know, where you can't plug every hole in terms of, you know, if you work for national security, you can plug as many likely holes, you know, things that you know within the realm of possibility, and also gaming scenarios, which they do, you know, ridiculous possibilities that they plan for, and regular possibilities. And of course, there's intelligence gathering as well. So, if funny people are crossing the border suddenly, maybe a few weeks in advance of a major event in Iran, that will be taken note of. But, this was obviously an intelligence operation, intelligence/military operation. It made Iran look bad. It was intended to make Iran look bad, an incoming so-called moderate president on his inauguration, and to strike at the heart of the resistance. But again, these are emotional hits. This does not, the military should be used for political outcomes. Intelligence should be used to secure political outcomes. The assassination of Ismael Haniyeh is not a political outcome. It's an op. It's an operation that has no political outcome, okay, that is beneficial to the state of Israel, other than to cause despair in the hearts of his supporters. And of course that happened, but it was a week ago, and no sign of the Palestinian resistance slowing down, no sign of Iran slowing down, or any other members of the resistance axis. If anything, this ambitionless operation of Israel's has just resulted in what is probably going to be the most devastating military hit that Israel has ever experienced in recent memory. Here in Lebanon and elsewhere in the region, I think in foreign capitals, we're all waiting to see how that pans out and what it looks like.
So let's go back to Lebanon, because as we were preparing for this interview, Israel was bombing Lebanon again. You mentioned to me that you could even hear the blasts. Tell us about the latest on the ground in Lebanon and how people are feeling with Israel bombing deeper and deeper into Lebanon right now.
So as Israel deepens geographically its strikes, Hezbollah too geographically deepens its strikes into the occupation state. So it's a kind for kind of warfare going on here. Israel was not bombing Lebanon. What I was saying was there were massive sonic booms. I call them, sonic bombs or noise bombs. But I've never heard anything so loud. Even the port blast, which absolutely devastated my apartment, and took down all the windows and took down parts of the ceiling, wasn't this loud. So two within some 10, 15 minutes of each other, meant to strike terror into the hearts of people, but about 30 minutes or so in advance of an awaited speech by Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. So I can assure you that all Israel achieved by those terror, sonic booms was to make sure every single Lebanese in this country rushed to their TV screens. It was like an alarm clock to make sure they watched Hassan Nasrallah and what he was going to say. Today, they hit a place in the south called Abba, and in very quick retaliation, I think probably the quickest we've seen so far by Israel, by Hezbollah, they sent in suicide drones above, in areas above Haifa. And then there were confirmations of one death and many injured, I think something like 19 injured. And then just within the last hour, it emerged that, in fact, the Israeli settler who was killed was not killed by a Hezbollah drone. He was killed by shrapnel from an Iron Dome interceptor missile that fell on him and his car. So, which actually brings us back to the events of Majd al-Shams, right? And Israel and Western media rushing to say Hezbollah launched a missile attack, killing a dozen children and civilians playing football in Majd al-Shams, which is in the Syrian Golan Heights. By the way, these are not Israelis, these are Syrian Druze. And Israel therefore had to launch all these strikes and retaliatory strikes against the resistance axis for Druze kids that it itself targets, but in that case, what was determined by the Druze citizens of Majd al-Shams is that it was an Iron Dome interceptor missile that fell on this football field and absolutely, was responsible for the casualties. So today as well, the one Israeli death that we are aware of was caused by an Iron Dome interceptor missile that fell on his head. So that's today's news. But every day there's these clashes that, to be honest, nobody outside Lebanon pays attention to. I don't know how much you guys cover at MintPress News these events, but here in the region we do cover the Lebanon events, and they're not read as much as you think. I think people are extremely interested in Lebanon right now, but only in the sense of a geopolitical war, as opposed to what is actually happening, on the ground in Lebanon. The South has been brutalized by Israeli missiles and bombs for 10 months now, since October 8th. And, it doesn't take up much space in any Western newspaper. So the gall of Western politicians rushing into Lebanon to try to mitigate any response by Hezbollah and other members of the Axis, and to push them to only do a face-saving limited response, is astounding to me. These are the same governments that are arming Israel to the hilt, underreporting or not reporting at all what's happening in Lebanon, the people and the civilians who have died. I mean, entire border villages in the south of Lebanon are obliterated. It looks like Gaza, in other words, and we don't even see those pics. So, these same people then coming here and making demands and saying, I don't know if you saw this article, but the Americans apparently were promising Lebanon, listen, we'll get your collapsed financial system back on its feet. And what did they promise? Things, we'll make sure you have running electricity from Jordan, supplied by Jordan and Egypt, which they promised 2 years ago, but only then to counter the fact that Iran was started to send oil and gas to Lebanon, and the Americans didn't want that happening. So they made these promises and they never delivered. So suddenly the Americans were here promising everything that Lebanon has needed so desperately. The U.S. considers Lebanon an allied state, a friendly state. They've never done it, which just goes to show how manufactured the crisis in Lebanon is and how easily resolved it is if players like the United States and its allies in the region wanted to help Lebanon out.
You mentioned Nasrallah earlier, and we have seen Nasrallah effectively shut down trade through its Red Sea blockade. Israel's economy has been completely shattered, seriously harmed by this months-long war, including the port of Eilat, which has filed for bankruptcy because of Yemen's Red Sea blockade. So what are Yemen's long-term goals here?
Yes, Yemen is the surprise of the resistance axis and their unity of fronts. Who would have thought that war-torn Yemen, severely depleted in all manner humanitarian, shortages of food and energy and medicines, basic supplies, not having access to their ports and goods, their currency running rampant, disease spreading in the impoverished, war-torn state, that they would rise up and become the star of the axis of the unity of fronts, by just having the absolute nerve to hit the Americans, the British, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis. I always say the reason the Yemenis do this is because they don't read Western media. They haven't slowly been tamed and groomed over the years, like other members of the resistance axis, into displaying good behavior or trying to put their best face forward. The Yemenis are basically like, don't mess with us, we'll mess with you. And they do it. That's it. They don't understand that, oh, you can't hit an American. You cannot kill an Israeli. They don't, that's not within their realm of understanding. It's, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You do this to me, I'll do it back to you. It's how it works. Actually, international law supports that. If you get hit, you have the right to retaliate. End of, right? So Yemen has launched its operations. And of course, the other element that was surprising was the range of Yemen's missiles, okay? To be able to cross all this different airspace and hit Israel, of course, at its southernmost border. But don't forget, a few months ago, maybe even less than that, Yemen announced that it was launching, I think its fourth phase in its war, in its escalation, which essentially meant that it would be targeting Israeli-bound shipments in the Mediterranean Sea, which is another length. Okay, that's an extension of the missile ranges maybe we've seen so far. And then Yemen did the unthinkable. It sent a drone, okay, an armed drone to Tel Aviv, all right, which nobody spotted, nobody intercepted. You can't even imagine. You have to look at a map. I hope your viewers are now pulling out a map to look at how Yemen could possibly get a drone to Tel Aviv, So, Yemen sends this drone and hits Tel Aviv. And then Yemen announces, we're now going to be hitting Tel Aviv, okay? So they got their armed drone through once. Can they do it again? But, we've also noted that the Israeli intercepting missiles and air defense systems are regularly hitting birds. They're so trigger happy now because, drones are hard to spot. You can send out a whole fleet of them. They could be flying in different directions. And also essentially what the resistance does when it sends out fleets of drones is to, make the air defenses scramble in Israel. A drone costs a few $1,000, but each Iron Dome missile costs Israel $50,000. So it's a psychological game as well. But now Yemen has, as you mentioned initially, that it declared its operations first in the Red Sea. It expanded to the Gulf of Oman and other areas, and then into the Indian Ocean, because what Israel was doing was instead of the Red Sea route that would go through to the Suez Canal, right, and then to Israel, to Eilat, etc., they were going to take the long route around the Cape of Good Hope, South Africa, up over the west side of South Africa, over the top of Africa, through Europe, right, to the Mediterranean. And so a lot of these goods coming from the east towards Israel stop at Indian and Sri Lankan ports and then head, they're in the Indian Ocean heading towards, going around the African continent. And so Yemen decided to strike ships in those areas too. So basically cutting off all trade routes, all possible waterway trade routes to Israel. And then the Mediterranean Sea became interesting because, of course, whoever manages to get to Israel or close enough to Israel will come the Mediterranean route. Israel has the ports at Ashdod and Haifa there. And as we know from the 2006 war, you can shut, Hezbollah itself back then, 18 years ago, could shut down the ports. But now Yemen's saying, we're going to do that, honey. And this is just going to turn the screws on Israel, where the temperature is rising every day. As we've said at the Cradle, this is how the resistance axis boils the Israeli frog, by incrementally raising the temperature 1 degree at a time, until, where the frog doesn't realize he's being boiled until, of course, he's dead. So this is the plan. And of course, the psychological warfare is intense. Usually it's sort of Israel and its Western media proxies blaring scary news to capitals here in West Asia. But now the psychological warfare is being applied against them. I mean, any Israeli who wasn't taking shelter prior to the retaliatory strikes of Hezbollah today, where a regular settler was killed in his car and 19 other injured, is running to a shelter thereafter. So, and of course, they haven't retaliated immediately. This resistance retaliation that we're being promised for the assassinations of the Hezbollah and Hamas heads or commanders. So every day that passes, people get more and more worried. And that's how it's playing out. And Yemen plays an essential role in this because, as British and American and French and other European naval commanders who have left to resupply in the Red Sea area, in their operations against Yemen, the defensive missiles used against Yemen's projectiles, have repeatedly said, these people are just frightening. They're frightening. They have no restraints. There's nothing, there's no line they won't cross. They're saying this of the Yemenis. And this is sort of Yemen suddenly become the bad cop, of the resistance axis. The ones who, if you don't give in to their demands right away, they will retaliate and strike you in ways that nobody else has ever done before, So that's a real asset to the unity of fronts. And I think Yemen has showed it will play a role in this until there is a Gaza ceasefire, a complete Gaza ceasefire. None of this, as the Americans have guaranteed for Israel, after you get your hostages back, just in the last few days, we were told via media that once the Israelis get their hostages back, the U.S. will support a continuation of the war in Gaza. None of that is going to hold. Plus, keep in mind that Israel has said that even if there is a Gaza ceasefire, its issues and conflict with these other fronts will not cease. Okay. What's interesting, for people who say, why is Yemen hitting Israel? Israeli troops. Israel has a shared military base on sovereign Yemeni territory on the island of Socotra and the Socotra archipelago. And that has been there for years. If you want to say who fired the first shot, it was Israel who fired the first shot at Yemen. And so, Yemen is fully justified in its alliance. It's fully justified in its actions. And it looks like Yemen is set to escalate. They also claim to have hypersonic missiles, which we haven't seen, but those can reach Israel if in fact they exist within 10 to 15 minutes, and no intercepting missile can take those down.
Now, that would be an interesting development, which raises another question that I have about how a regional escalation would look like between Israel and its regional allies like Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, and the Gulf Arab states, which have effectively helped Israel circumvent that Red Sea blockade, versus the axis of resistance.
I don't think the Arab allies who have friendly relations with Iran and other members of the resistance axis, don't forget Syria is the one Arab state in the axis, and most of these Gulf countries, other than Qatar, have been making for the last few years a beeline to Damascus to try to straighten out their relations, reestablish embassies, and are actually, some of them are actively lobbying for the removal of the US's Caesar Act sanctions that have devastated Syria's economy. They have good and cordial relations, diplomatic ties with Iran, resuscitated last year by the Beijing agreement, where Saudi Arabia and Iran reestablished ties after many years at odds. It was a sign that the Saudis, under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has his Vision 2030 strategy, a big turnaround, social, economic turnaround of Saudi Arabia, and who is falling behind in his goals. He started the Yemen war, in essence, the Saudi aggression against Yemen with the Emiratis. And after a few years of getting hit by Nasrallah in Yemen, decided it was enough. He wanted to focus on his real goals. What he thought and said publicly would take days, if not weeks, ended up taking years. And just actually, if you look at the Cradle feature article today on our homepage, it is about how the Yemenis, in a very short period, made the Saudis kneel in a recent deal struck between Saudi Arabia and Sana'a, where the Nasrallah-backed government is based. What the Americans, it's believed the Americans had pushed the Saudis to get their caretaker government in Aden to demand that all Yemeni banks are relocated to Aden, and of course, taking control of the airport in Sana'a and stopping flights. And then the Saudis detained a number of Yemeni pilgrims in Jeddah as they were meant to fly back to Sana'a. Yemen went full force on this. I think one of the Ansarullah leaders just tweeted something like 3 days. Okay, which was taken as in 3 days, if we don't get our Hajj pilgrims back, you're going to pay. And you know how we do pay back. We hit your cities, we hit your oil installations, we hit Aramco, we hit your ports, etc. So in record time, the Saudis struck a deal with Sana'a. They reversed course on all of the basically U.S. demands to move banks there. They reopened the Sana'a airport for flights and introduced flights to Amman and somewhere else, Egypt, India. I can't remember, one of those places. So, in that kind of situation, it's very clear that the Saudis are going to great lengths to avoid any kind of confrontation with Yemen. What they experienced with Yemen in years of war was bad enough, but now they're watching Yemen do the unthinkable, take on Israel, which a lot of Arab leaders have long determined is an untouchable state. Oh, no, don't go there. Oh, just bend over, to their demands. Just, humor them, right? Strike deals with them, do backdoor deals with them, whatever placates Israel. Now they're seeing Yemen strike Israel so viscerally. Of course, the Saudis don't want to mess with Yemen. And Yemen is now part of the resistance axis and is part of this fight, indisputably. So what happens if Iran and Hezbollah and Yemen hit Israel? I'm sorry, who in the Gulf is going to be intercepting Yemeni weapons, and to what result, right? Of course, Jordan has sounded off again about nobody's going to violate our airspace. Doesn't matter if, Western military aircraft violate Jordan's airspace all the time, and NATO sets up a regional headquarters in Amman, as was just done last month. But no, we're not going to take any Iranian projectiles over our airspace. We're going to shoot them down for the safety of Jordanians. In fact, shooting down, projectiles, drones or missiles over your territory creates a bigger danger for your civilians than letting those projectiles fly overhead to their destination, as we saw in the last round in April. So Jordan looks set to participate in this. And now Ayman Safadi, the Jordanian foreign minister, was just in Iran yesterday, day before, and we're yet to see what the results of that was. I mean, for certain, the Russians and the Jordanians have and others, many others, through phone calls or actual visits to Tehran, have been urged by Western capitals to try to get Iran to minimize, to do a limited retaliatory strike. Iran has doubled down after these visits and said, no, we're going to do what's right. And so we'll see if Jordan participates. I think it was a real shame and stain on Jordan for having defended Israel militarily in April. And we'll see if they continue to go down that wrong trajectory, because they do have an option of just sitting it out. But I doubt Arab states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the two most powerful Gulf states, will participate in anything against Iran. Iran has warned these states, as they have on during the April strikes, and also after before their retaliatory strikes for the U.S. assassination of General Qasem Soleimani and Iraqi General Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, they've warned their neighbors that if they allow the launch of a single fighter jet, drone, or missile from their territory, that they will be legitimately considered targets for Iran. And I think most Gulf countries have taken Iran, at its word. I know after the April events, where it was very clear Jordan participated, it was always an American throwing in, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, though it's not clear at all how they participated. If, they would then caveat it by saying, well, they provided, what's it called? Surveillance and reconnaissance data. But keep in mind that the surveillance and the top-notch reconnaissance and surveillance data in the Gulf countries are American ones in American centers run by Americans. So while the information may have come from these countries, it wasn't necessarily by the governments of these states, but rather the American bases in these countries.
Okay, I want to go back to Lebanon. In response to the killing of Fuad Shukr, Hezbollah has said that the war has entered a new stage. What exactly does that mean? And then do you know what tactics will be used moving forward?
Nobody knows. I mean, that's a short answer. And nobody who says they know actually know the full range of it. I mean, one of the things about this axis, and I don't know if your reporters or yourself have come up against this. I mean, everything from this axis, very hard as the journalist to get something new and information from them. For them, every bit of information is on a need to know basis. And why would you tell a journalist? So when you see Western media, quote, unnamed Hezbollah fighters or Hezbollah commanders, it's a joke. We actually know a guy in Dahi, in the Beirut suburb of the southern suburb, who for years used to, during the entire Syrian war, for instance, used to set up meetings with fake Hezbollah commanders for the top US and British media outlets. Like, one day we're going to do a story on this because it's so bad, it's embarrassing. So it's very unclear. The Cradle did do our front page story yesterday was that an actual Hezbollah source had told our journalist that the strike would be simultaneous. A retaliatory strike for the assassinations by Hezbollah, Iran, and Yemen would be simultaneous. Now, we didn't even know how to present it because, is this true? Does this person know? Why would they tell us? Do you know, like, you get paranoid if someone in the axis tells you something, you're like, wait a second, why are they telling me this? But it was our duty as journalists to report what was said by a Hezbollah source. It wasn't a person close to the organization. It was from the organization. And who knows, maybe it was a diversionary tactic where they used the media, and we won't go back to that source in the future, do you know? But in terms of how they will respond, many people have talked about the various target banks that could be used or, targeted in this scenario. Anything from obliterating Israeli military bases, airstrips, service infrastructure, gas fields, right? There's even Tel Aviv, though I seriously doubt it would be like bombs on Tel Aviv. It would be something significant, a qualitative target in Tel Aviv, just to show that they are prepared to hit the city so that Israel doesn't hit Beirut, right? So, I mean, that may be shown. The other thing that's possible is that we will see new weapons being employed by the resistance axis in this phase of the war. Okay, so new target banks would be one thing we're looking for. New type of weapons that we haven't seen in combat before being utilized is another potential scenario. During the Iran Iranian strikes on Israel on April 13th and 14th, a lot of Western experts and commentators immediately rushed to pass judgment and say it was an absolute fail. We hit down 90% of their, incoming projectiles. Whereas in fact, anybody genuinely in an army, in a military command, knows what Israel did was collect critical intelligence on their adversaries that night. They sent a lot of slow-moving drones, right? Slow-moving projectiles that took like hours, like 9 hours to reach their destination. But enough of them that Israel and its allies in the Americans, the French, the British, and Jordan would have to deploy their air defense systems, and Iran could see where these projectiles, the air defenses, were coming from. They were also able to see which countries would participate to defend Israel, where UK aircraft and American aircraft would take off from. Would they take off from the 2 UK bases in Cyprus? Would they take off from Saudi Arabia? Would they take off from Jordan? So that was a recon operation. And interestingly, the missiles used many of the missiles had these sort of decoys. They would shoot off multiple decoys, each which would be targeted by Israeli air defenses. Depleting Israeli air defense missiles. They say Israel spent $1.3 billion that night, whereas Iran spent like 2% of that. And so there were so many aspects to that Iranian operation. But here's the thing. So a lot of decoys were employed, meant to be intercepted by air defenses, while the actual targets, which were 3 Israeli facilities, 2 air bases, and 1 intelligence facility in the Golan, were all struck. Iran struck all its targets that night. These 3 facilities were targeted because they had all participated in the operation to strike Iran's consulate in Damascus, which is what this retaliatory strike was for. So in that sense, I would be seriously disappointed, Mnar, if I was surprised by this, because it's like military as art, the way they're responding, the shock effects, the surprise, their ability to use the military or military operations to achieve either deterrence or a political outcome. That's what militaries must be used for. So I think I should be on all these components, but how any of it will shape up is impossible to tell right now.
Well, this is my final question for you, Sharmine. The presidential elections are fast approaching here in the United States, and Donald Trump is appearing to be a favorite with the bookmakers to return to the White House. So what do you think a Trump presidency will bring to policy in the Middle East?
We can only judge by Trump's first presidency. He was the U.S. president to greenlight the assassination of Iran and Iraq's top military commanders, which really shocked the world. This was a no-go zone. He crossed all red lines there. But in some sense, I think Trump is just like, in a way, George W. Bush, a kind of useful idiot, right? Like not steeped in knowledge, strategy, history, enough to actually think for himself. So listens to a lot of people. And at that point, he had Jared Kushner's ear, and Jared Kushner is all about Israel. And so it was easy perhaps to get into Trump's ear to kill this Soleimani fellow. You know what I mean? I kind of envision that's how it played out. The thing that I can say based on his presidency is we did see a sitting U.S. president, the first in many consecutive U.S. presidents who did not launch a war. Okay, he tends to think wars are not that important, that actually the right way. He thinks strike a deal instead of going to war. Okay, so this is the businessman mentality. He wrote Art of the Deal. And so he's like, I'm going to go in there and strike a deal that's going to benefit the U.S. The other thing is Trump doesn't like to spend U.S. dollars in foreign countries. He's said that many times, and he's demonstrated that he's willing to pull the rug out from under his friends at NATO by saying, we're just not going to keep carrying you guys. Give us 2% of your budget for NATO, or we're out of here, right? So that's part of the art of the negotiation, but he tends to want to go that route with adversaries rather than a military route. It's not a field he's familiar with. Many of the generals he liked are people who thought America's wars were dumb, and it's time to get out. And so if that carries over from his first presidency to this one, we will see then a replay of Trump demanding that U.S. military troops get out of Syria and Iraq, which could be absolute, which is exactly what the resistance would like, which is exactly what Syria and Iraq would like. Don't forget when he did that repeatedly in his first administration. What was his name now? Mad Dog. What was his name? Defense Secretary? Mad Dog. Oh, whatever. So insignificant. He quit. And then we forgot his name, But basically, the establishment is not going to like that. But I think Trump will probably come, if he's reelected, it will be with it will likely be with a solid mandate. I just feel like he's up against a much weaker adversary if, in fact, Kamala Harris and her newly named VP candidate are his opponents in this election. Joe Biden had a long legacy of government roles and understood foreign policy, et cetera, very well. And Kamala Harris can barely put a sentence together that makes sense. There is a real sense, even though I haven't been to the States for a number of years, there's a real sense that there's some really crazy civil stuff that is happening, like not civil war, but some tensions that I've never seen or sensed before. It's been a work in progress. It's not right now. It's been for a while. And I just think, it's because you have these visionless leaders. They're never planning for 25 years ahead. They're planning for the 2-year election cycle. And this is the problem. There is no plan for America. It's just quick fixes, Band-Aids. Nothing gets fundamentally fixed. And so you can start to smell the stagnation, in the country, and it seems to be pervasive everywhere. So anyways, I think whoever comes in, look at you poor dears, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, those are your choices. Like, seriously, there's like 350 million Americans, and a lot of like the online people who comment on our videos and our articles are so much smarter than the politicians who serve them, to be honest. You could pick any one of them and they'd probably do a better job, So I think there's a real challenge there. Whoever comes in, if Kamala Harris comes in, she will absolutely be, the poster child for the swamp. She will take orders from them and not unquestioningly, execute on them. So nothing will change with America. Whereas Donald Trump, he does have his own mind. He has his own opinions. He's not afraid to share them. And if the establishment is beating him down, he goes back into the big town halls and gets his mojo back from the crowd adoration, and then walks back in and says, no, this is how it's going to be. So if he makes a comeback, he makes a comeback with a mandate. He is the original comeback kid, right? And Who knows? But we can only judge him based on what he did last time around. And if the sum total of that is not launching a war and trying to get U.S. troops out of countries and shut down bases, because why the hell are we spending so much money in those foreign countries? I'm good. I'm good with that. And by the way, also winding down Ukraine, striking a deal with Zelensky and winding down Ukraine. Do you understand how many conflicts could be nipped in the bud by a Donald Trump presidency? Now, by the way, please don't let this be considered an endorsement of Trump. I mean, he's a buffoon in many, many ways to me. He's just not a sophisticated politician. I don't think you always need sophistication. I do think he brings a bit of everyman to his role, though he's a billionaire, so that separates him from the masses. But it's going to be interesting days. And of course, the establishment in the United States cannot stand Donald Trump. I mean, every major Western media publication and news, what is it called? Broadcast news station, and every Karen in America will just be screaming Trump down at every opportunity. And I think that creates that's going to escalate tensions domestically as well. Don't forget also, he may not have even made it to the Republican convention because of that assassination attempt. A lot's going down in America now. Let's see what happens if he becomes president and if he lasts.
Well, thank you so much, Sharmine, for joining us today. Always a pleasure, and I'm always learning so much from you. Thank you so much, and we'll have you on again soon.